Farewell to Manzanar by Jean and James Houston. Chapter 5 Almost a Family. At 7, I was too young to be insulted. The camp worked on me in a much different way. I wasn't aware of this at the time, of course. No one was except maybe Mama, and there was little she could have done to change what happened. It began in the mess hall. Before Manzanar, mealtime had always been the center of our family scene. In camp and afterward, I would often recall with deep yearning the old round wooden table in our dining room in Ocean Park, the biggest piece of furniture we owned, large enough to seat 12 or 13 of us at once. A tall row of elegant, lathe-turned spindles separated this table from the kitchen, allowing talk to pass from one room to the other. Dinners were always noisy, and they were always abundant with great pots of boiled rice, platters of homegrown vegetables, fish Papa caught. He would sit at the head of this table, with Mama next to him serving, and the rest of us arranged around the edges according to age, down to where Keo and I sat. So far away from our parents, it seemed at the time, we had our own enclosed nook inside this world. The grown-ups would be talking down at their end, while we two played our secret games, making eyes at each other when Papa gave the order to begin to eat, racing with chopsticks to scrape the last grain from our rice bowls, eyeing Papa to see if he had noticed who won. Now, in the mess halls, after a few weeks had passed, we stopped eating as a family. Mama tried to hold us together for a while, but it was hopeless. Granny was too feeble to walk across the block 3 times a day, especially during heavy weather, so May brought food to her in the barracks. My older brothers and sisters, meanwhile, began eating with their friends or eating somewhere blocks away in the hope of finding better food. The word would get around that the cook over in Block 22, say, really knew his stuff, and they would eat a few meals over there to test the rumor. Camp authorities frowned on mess hall hopping and tried to stop it. But the good cooks liked it. They liked to see long lines outside their kitchens and would work overtime to attract a crowd. Younger boys like Ray would make a game of seeing how many mess halls they could hit in one meal period. Be the first in line at Block 16, gobble down your food. Run to 17 by the middle of the dinner hour, gulp another helping. Hurry to 18 to make the end of that chow line and stuff in the third meal of the evening. They didn't need to do that. No matter how bad the food might be, you could always eat till you were full. Keo and I were too young to run around, but often we would eat in gangs with other kids, while the grown-ups sat at another table. I confess I enjoyed this part of it at the time. We all did. A couple of years after the camps opened, sociologists studying the life noticed what had happened to the families. They made some recommendations, and edicts went out that families must start eating together again. Most people resented this. They griped and grumbled. They were in the habit of eating with their friends, and until the mess hall system itself could be changed, not much could really be done. It was too late. My own family, after 3 years of mess hall living, collapsed as an integrated unit. Whatever dignity or feeling of filial strength we may have known before December 1941 was lost, and we did not recover it until many years after the war. Not until after Papa died and we began to come together again, trying to fill the vacuum his passing left in all our lives. The closing of the camps in the fall of 1945 only aggravated what had begun inside. Papa had no money then and could not get work. Half of our family had already moved to the East Coast, where jobs had opened up for them. The rest of us were relocated into a former defense workers' housing project in Long Beach. In that small apartment, there never was enough room for all of us to sit down for a meal. We ate in shifts, and I yearned all the more for a huge round table in Ocean Park. Soon after we were released, I wrote a paper for a 7th grade journalism class describing how we used to hunt grunion before the war. The whole family would go down to Ocean Park Beach after dark, when the grunion were running, and build a big fire in the sand. I would watch Papa and my older brothers splash through the moonlit surf to scoop out the fish. Then we'd rush back to the house where Mama would fry them up and set the sizzling pan on the table, with soy sauce and horseradish for a midnight meal. I ended the paper with this sentence: "The reason I want to remember this is because I know we'll never be able to do it again." You might say it would have happened sooner or later anyway. This sliding apart of such a large family in post-war California. People get married, their interests shift, but there is no escaping the fact that our internment accelerated the process, made it happen so suddenly it was almost tangible. Not only did we stop eating at home, there was no longer a home to eat in. The cubicles we had were too small for anything you might call living. Mama couldn't cook meals there. It was impossible to find any privacy there. We slept there and spent most of our waking hours elsewhere. Mama had gone to work again soon after we arrived. The call went out for people with any kind of skill to offer their services. Thousands were responding with great surges of community spirit, sometimes with outright patriotism, wanting to do their part. Woody signed on as a carpenter. One of my brothers-in-law was a roofing foreman. Another ran a reservoir crew. Mama had worked as a dietitian in Washington after she was married. In camp, this was high-priority training. In addition to the daily multitude, those amateur cooks were faced with allergy cases, diabetics, nursing mothers, infants who required special feeding. For Mama, it was also a way to make a little money, $19 a month. This was top wage for an internee. Unskilled labor started at 8. All volunteer, of course. You didn't have to get out of bed in the morning if you didn't want to. Mama wanted to work. She had a monthly fee to pay the warehouse in Los Angeles, where she had stored what remained of our furniture and silver just before we evacuated. She worried about this constantly. She worried about Papa, too. Letters from home trickled in once or twice a month, with half the words blacked out, calling her sweetheart for the first time in 15 years. She was always distracted, staring at things I could never see. I would try to get her attention, grab her around the legs. At night in bed, she would hug me close, but during the day, she never seemed to notice. Adrift, I began to look elsewhere for attention and thus took the first steps out of my child's realm toward a world of grown-ups other than my parents. Though I was only 7, my images of certain people from this period are very precise, because I had begun to see adults for the first time. On Terminal Island, I first saw Asians, those demon children who had terrorized me. At Manzanar, past the fear of slanted eyes and high cheekbones, I watched with fresh amazement the variety of faces and bodies and costumes all around me. This may have resulted in part from the life Manzanar had forced upon us all. Once the weather warmed up, it was an out-of-doors life, where you only went home at night, when you finally had to. 10,000 people on an endless promenade inside the square mile of barbed wire that was the wall around our city. One of our neighbors was a tall, broad woman, taller than anyone in camp as far as I recall. She walked erectly and wore an Aunt Jemima scarf around her head. She was married to a Japanese man, and they had adopted a little Japanese girl I sometimes played with. But this woman, I realized much later, was half black, with light mulatto skin, passing as a Japanese in order to remain with her husband. She wore scarves everywhere to cover her giveaway hair. In the barracks facing ours, there lived an elegant woman who astounded me each time I saw her. She and her husband both came from Japan, and her long aristocratic face was always a ghastly white. In traditional fashion, she powdered it with rice flour every morning. By old country standards, this made her more beautiful. For a long time I thought she was diseased. Two more white faces stand out in my memory. They wore white shoes, white hose, white dresses above their bleached faces. Their foreheads had been shaved halfway over their scalps' curve to make a sharp widow's peak, where starched black hair began to arch upward, reminding me of a cobra's hood. Their lips were gone. Their brows were plucked. They were always together, a pair of reptilian kabuki creatures at loose in the camp hospital. You might say they were the negatives for the two other women I soon began to see almost every day, and in fact saw more for a while than I did my mother. Their robes were black. Their heads were hooded in white. Sister Mary Suzanne was about 40 then, a frail gentlewoman from Japan who could speak no English. Sister Mary Bernadette was a feisty, robust little Canadian Japanese who spoke both languages fluently. They were Maryknoll nuns, members of that missionary order whose special task is to go out into a country with knowledge of its language and convert its people to the Catholic faith. Before the war, they had run an orphanage in Los Angeles for children of Japanese ancestry, evacuated to Manzanar and given the job of caring for some 50 orphans interned there. They set up what came to be known as Children's Village, and they had one barracks turned into a chapel. They were joined by Father Steinbach, one of the few Caucasians to live among us inside the compound and eat in our mess halls. He was greatly admired for this, and many internees converted to Catholicism before the camp was closed. I was almost one of them. Papa stepped in just before my baptism day. If he had been there during those early months, I probably would never have started spending time with the Maryknolls. He was always suspicious of organized religions. I think he had already tried to scare me away from Catholics. That was one of his prime methods of instruction, fear. On my way home from school each day in Ocean Park, I would break into a run as I passed the local Catholic church. The nuns I glimpsed were robed and ghostly figures I wanted no part of. Culturally, we were like those Jews who observe certain traditions but never visit a synagogue. We kept a little Buddhist shrine in the house, and we celebrate a few Japanese holidays that were religiously connected, the way Christmas is, but we never said prayers. I had never been inside a Buddhist church, and as for Christianity, I had not heard the word God until we reached Terminal Island. I first heard about Jesus when the one friend I made there, another Japanese girl, took me to a Baptist Sunday school on the island, where a Caucasian teacher bewildered me with pictures of lambs and donkeys and golden dome pavilions. For some reason, these did not appeal to me nearly as much as the stories of the saints and martyrs I heard a few months later when I began to study catechism with the Maryknolls. Soon I was over there every afternoon and most of Sunday. With no regular school to attend and no home to spend time in, it's no mystery that I should have been drawn to these two kind and generous women. They had organized a recreation program. They passed out candy, but what kept me coming back once I started were the tales of the unfortunate women like St. Agatha, whose breasts were cut off when she refused to renounce her faith. I had to walk nearly a mile to reach their chapel, and walk a mile back. That summer it was miserably hot, over 100 degrees most days, yet I made the trip gladly. A big, homely girl about 20 years old who wore boy shoes and an Eisenhower jacket taught catechism to the younger kids. She loved to sit us down and fix us with the eye of a mother superior and tell us about St. Agatha and St. Juliana, who was boiled alive, and St. Marcella, who was whipped to death by the Goths. I was fascinated with the miseries of women who had suffered and borne such afflictions. On my way home, I would hike past row upon row of black barracks, watching mountains waver through that desert heat with the sun trying to dry up my very blood, and imagine in some childish way that I was among them. that I too was up there on the screen of history, in a white lace catechism dress, sweating and grimy yet selflessly carrying my load. I fulfilled this fantasy one blistering afternoon when the heat finally got me. Sunstroke. While crossing one of the wide sandy fire breaks that separated some of the blocks, I passed out. This put me in bed for a week. After I recovered, several months went by before I resumed my catechism. For one thing, Papa discouraged me. It was just before this happened that he had returned from Fort Lincoln. He was back among us, making decisions, giving commands. For a while it seemed we would almost be a family again, but it didn't turn out that way. He was not the same man. Something terrible had happened to him in North Dakota. He arrived at Manzanar in a Greyhound bus. We all went down to the main gate to meet him. Everyone but Woody's wife, Chizu, who was in the camp hospital. The previous day she'd given birth to Papa's first grandson. She named him George in honor of Papa's return. 2 of my sisters were pregnant at the time, and they were there at the gate in hot weather smocks, along with Woody, who had left the hospital long enough to welcome Papa back, and Granny and Mama and the rest of the family. A dozen of us standing in the glare, excited, yet very reverent as the bus pulled in. The door wished open, and the first thing we saw was a cane. I will never forget it. Poking from the shaded interior into the sunlight, a straight polished maple limb spotted with dark-lidded eyes where small knotholes had been stained and polished. Then Papa stepped out, wearing a fedora hat and a wilted white shirt. This was September 1942. He had been gone 9 months. He had aged 10 years. He looked over 60, gaunt, wilted as his shirt, underweight, leaning on that cane and favoring his right leg. He stood there surveying his clan, and nobody moved, not even Mama, waiting to see what he would do or say, waiting for some cue from him as to how we should deal with this. I was the only one who approached him. I had not thought of him much at all after he was taken away. He was simply gone. Now I was happy to see him, so happy to see him, that I ran up and threw my arms around his waist and buried my face in his belt. I thought I should be laughing and welcoming him home, but I started to cry. By this time everyone was crying. No one else had moved yet to touch him. It was as if the youngest, the least experienced, had been appointed to display what the others, held back by awe or fear, or some old country notion of respect for the patriarch, could not. I hugged him tighter, wanting to be happy that my father had come back. Yet I hurt so inside I could only welcome him with convulsive tears.